In the dark corners of history, not every tale of faith, family, and frontier life is what it appears to be. Some stories are hidden beneath layers of secrecy, twisted desires, and whispered rumors that spread like wildfire through small settlements. In 1839, Missouri, one such story surfaced, surrounding a family once tied to the very roots of early American religious movements. Behind closed doors, the Whitmer family became the subject of chilling accusations, acts so unthinkable, so grotesque, that they blurred the line between piety and perversion. This is not just a story of history, it is a descent into the most depraved shadows of human behavior. In the early decades of the 19th century, the name Whitmer carried a certain weight that resonated deeply within the scattered settlements of Missouri. To many, they were not merely another frontier family eking out a living in a land that demanded unrelenting toil, but instead were seen as people of authority, pillars within a religious movement that was still carving its way into the turbulent heart of America. Their reputation was carefully built upon the foundations of faith and pioneering resilience, an image of steadfast believers clinging to divine guidance while the wilderness pressed in around them. Yet behind that carefully constructed image lay a far more complex and unsettling reality. For the Whitmer legacy was not merely one of scripture and settlement, but of secrets, control, and whispers that seemed to follow them wherever they went. What makes their story all the more horrifying is the jarring contrast between how they were perceived in public and what darker truths seemed to linger in the private corners of their household, a duplicity that would set the stage for accusations that shocked their community and stained their name in history. As the Whitmers grew in prominence, their connection to the early Mormon movement gave them an aura of sanctity. They were not just ordinary settlers, but were part of the fabric of a new faith that promised revelations and a reordering of society. In frontier communities where survival often depended on trust and shared belief, families like the Whitmers wielded an influence that extended beyond material wealth. They commanded respect, and more importantly, they were shielded by the reverence of others. This shield of reputation allowed them to maneuver without suspicion, to silence doubts, and to dismiss any faint rumors that may have threatened to tarnish their image. What neighbors saw was a family immersed in devotion, active in religious affairs, and seemingly unwavering in their convictions. But even then, cracks were forming beneath the polished exterior, and those who dared to look closely noticed that their fervor sometimes carried a strange edge, one that blurred the line between zeal and something far more disturbing. The isolation of frontier life often provided fertile ground for secrets to flourish. The Whitmer household, large and busy, became a place where power dynamics grew unchecked. Their patriarchal authority was absolute, upheld not only by the customs of the time but reinforced by the sacred weight of scripture and prophecy. This dominance was rarely questioned, for in a religiously infused community, to challenge the Whitmers was to risk challenging God himself. Such unchecked authority allowed for distortions of faith to creep in quietly, unnoticed at first, but later becoming the backbone of far more sinister practices. When the boundaries of morality could be stretched under the guise of divine will, the family's influence became a dangerous tool that ensured both compliance and silence from those who might have otherwise spoken out. Stories whispered later suggested that while the family's outward legacy was tied to the birth of a religious movement, their private actions began to warp the very teachings they preached. The Whitmers' place in Missouri history is not merely marked by their contributions to the faith, but by the shadow those contributions cast, a shadow that became impossible to ignore as unsettling patterns of control, secrecy, and exploitation took shape. What made it all the more terrifying to those who later pieced together fragments of testimony was that their acts were not simply indulgences of human weakness, but systematic perversions carried out under the sanctified veil of religion. Such distortions of authority and faith did not just corrode the trust of their immediate household, but spread unease across the community once whispers began to emerge. The Whitmer legacy thus became twofold: the official history, which painted them as important figures in the religious and social fabric of the frontier, and the whispered legacy, far darker and spoken only in hushed tones, that told of a family whose power corrupted every bond it touched. Neighbors noticed odd behaviors, unexplained absences, and the kind of secrecy that felt too heavy for an ordinary family simply living out their faith. There were nights when strange sounds seemed to emanate from the household, nights when certain rooms were sealed away from prying eyes, and an air of fear that seemed to hover over those most closely tied to the family. These elements, small in isolation, built together into a pattern that suggested a carefully hidden darkness beneath the facade of piety. In this way, the Whitmer legacy illustrates how history often preserves only the side that is most convenient, while the truth simmers beneath layers of silence. The family's name continued to appear in accounts of the religious movement, etched into scripture and testimony, but little was said of the disturbing undercurrents that swirled beneath. And yet, the mere survival of rumors, the persistence of local tales, and the uncanny discomfort that accompanied mention of the Whitmer household all pointed to a reality that could not be erased, no matter how diligently official accounts tried to bury it. The legacy of the Whitmers was thus not simply one of religious devotion or pioneering strength, but of a haunting duality, a family revered on one hand and feared on the other, a family whose reputation allowed them to manipulate faith into a mask for unspeakable practices, leaving behind a scar upon the history of Missouri that still unsettles those who dare to examine it closely. The Whitmer household in Missouri was unlike many others of its time, for while most frontier families lived lives that were open to the gaze of neighbors and marked by the shared struggles of survival, their home seemed to fold in upon itself, shutting out the outside world in ways that raised unease. From the outside, it was not unusual to see drawn curtains, locked doors, and shuttered windows, but within the tight-knit communities of the 1830s and 1840s, such secrecy was anything but ordinary. In towns where families leaned on one another for help, protection, and companionship, the Whitmers set themselves apart with behaviors that cloaked their private life in shadows. Whispers grew around their household, not of ordinary disputes or misfortunes, but of strange practices that seemed to cross the line between religious devotion and hidden perversion. Neighbors recalled odd sounds that drifted into the night from behind those closed shutters, the muffled voices of gatherings that seemed more intense than simple prayers. These voices were sometimes punctuated by cries that were difficult to explain, sounds that carried with them both desperation and restraint, as though those inside were forbidden from letting their emotions escape too loudly. Over time, tales began to spread of locked rooms within the Whitmer home, chambers to which not everyone in the household was granted access. Children whispered to other children of forbidden doors that creaked open only in the darkest hours of night, where gatherings were held that bore little resemblance to the religious meetings publicly preached by their elders. To outsiders, these might have sounded like the fancies of youthful imagination, but the consistency with which these rumors surfaced pointed to something deeper, something carefully hidden. Faith was often used as the justification for the strange and secretive behavior. Frontier life was hard, and religion was a balm for many, but in the Whitmer home it seemed to serve as both shield and weapon. Rituals were explained away as holy exercises, prayers carried out in the name of devotion, yet the secrecy with which they were guarded told another story. Some neighbors noticed that certain members of the family seemed uneasy, their eyes darting, their demeanor heavy, as though they carried burdens too heavy to speak of. Those closest to the family dared not raise their concerns openly, for to do so was to risk being branded as one who blasphemed against men considered chosen and devout. The Whitmers' influence and the sanctity of their religious associations allowed them to brush aside suspicion, but inside their walls the silence was suffocating. It was said that particular rooms in the house were arranged not for ordinary living but for practices that demanded both privacy and submission. The windows were shuttered so tightly that no light could escape, the doors fitted with locks that only a select few controlled. Within those rooms, rituals were performed that blurred the lines between spiritual communion and acts that stripped away innocence and dignity. While details were scarce, those who later came forward spoke of circles of prayer that devolved into acts justified by claiming divine approval, of practices where faith was manipulated to demand obedience, and of victims who were told their suffering was a necessary sacrifice to preserve the sanctity of the family. In such an environment, secrecy was not merely a habit, but a requirement, for exposure would have meant the unraveling of the Whitmers' carefully constructed public image. Fear became the greatest tool for enforcing silence. Those who questioned what took place behind those locked doors were met with threats of eternal damnation, reminders that God himself had supposedly sanctioned such practices, and warnings that to reveal them would bring ruin not only upon the household, but upon the faith of an entire community. In a time when religion was inseparable from daily life, such threats carried immense weight. Those who endured the secrecy did so in isolation, unable to find allies, for each feared the repercussions of breaking the silence. The family's patriarchal control extended over every corner of the household. ensuring that even whispers of dissent never left the property. Over time, however, the burden of silence weighed heavily, and cracks began to show. Small hints of distress made their way into the public eye, though never in a way that could be fully exposed. Averted gazes, trembling hands, sudden absences from community gatherings, all of these became subtle signals that something within the Whitmer home was deeply wrong. Yet the power of their name, their reputation as religious leaders, was strong enough to override suspicion. Those who noticed chose not to speak, convincing themselves that the whispers must have been exaggerations or that perhaps strange practices were merely misunderstood exercises of faith. This willful blindness from the community allowed the secrecy to continue, giving the Whitmers freedom to persist in their rituals behind locked doors. The image of secrecy within the household grew into a legend of its own. Neighbors would pass by and remark on how seldom the family allowed others inside, how quickly the doors were closed, how fiercely they guarded their privacy. In a world where most homes were open to visitors at nearly any time, the Whitmers created a fortress, both physical and spiritual, that shut out the scrutiny of others. Each locked room became a symbol of something unseen, each shuttered window a reminder that whatever happened inside was not meant for the world beyond. For those who lived nearby, the Whitmer home was a place that inspired both reverence and dread, a house where the sacred and the profane seemed to collide, leaving only shadows for others to speculate upon. The secrecy that defined the Whitmer household was not the ordinary privacy of a frontier family, but a calculated effort to hide practices that would have horrified their neighbors had they ever come fully to light. It was secrecy enforced by faith, by fear, and by the powerful reputation of a family who claimed divine authority. In those locked rooms, behind those shuttered windows, within the suffocating silence that pressed down upon those forced to endure it, the truth remained hidden, festering in the dark, waiting for the day when the whispers would finally slip past the walls that had so carefully contained them. The Whitmers' use of faith as a shield and justification for their actions was one of the most unsettling aspects of their story, for in a community bound so tightly by religion, it was almost impossible to question a family who claimed divine sanction. The language of Scripture was twisted in their household. Phrases once meant to inspire hope and devotion turned into tools of manipulation and control. In the frontier setting of Missouri during 1839, the authority of religion was more than spiritual comfort. It was law, identity, and survival. Those who held power in matters of faith held power over every other aspect of life, and the Whitmers understood this well. By presenting their most disturbing practices as acts of obedience to God, they stripped away the ability of others to resist, for to resist was to risk being seen as resisting the divine itself. They wove religious rhetoric into the most intimate and invasive acts, convincing victims that what was happening to them was not sin, but sacrifice, not cruelty, but sanctification. Faith became a leash, tethering each member of the household in silence. For once, someone believed that God had decreed their suffering. Escape seemed not only impossible, but blasphemous. It is said that prayers were used to prepare for acts that defiled innocence, that hymns were sung in tones that masked perverse intention, and that the very rituals meant to lift the spirit were dragged into the mud of exploitation. Those who lived under the Whitmer roof learned quickly that resistance was not merely punished by man, but threatened with punishment from heaven itself, a weight far heavier than any earthly fear. This twisting of devotion was not random but systematic. The patriarchs of the household crafted narratives around prophecy and revelation, presenting themselves as chosen interpreters of God's will. In a time when new revelations were spoken of with fervor, it was not difficult for them to convince others that their authority extended even into the private spaces of the body. They proclaimed that what they demanded was ordained, that their practices were not carnal indulgences but holy duties, that those who participated were fulfilling divine covenants. Such manipulation blurred every boundary until the line between spiritual obedience and personal violation ceased to exist. Victims were told that refusal would anger God, that silence was proof of loyalty, and that their pain was proof of purity. With faith so deeply ingrained in the fabric of daily life, these twisted teachings became nearly impossible to resist. Neighbors who caught glimpses of the strange practices were themselves manipulated by this religious veneer. Outsiders were invited to view select rituals, carefully staged to appear as pious devotion, while the darker layers remained hidden behind closed doors. This performance of faith kept suspicion at bay, ensuring that the Whitmers' reputation as devout leaders endured. It also created a wall of protection against gossip, for in a deeply religious community, accusing someone of corruption risked being seen as blasphemous or faithless. Thus, the Whitmers not only exploited the vulnerable within their household but used the wider community's devotion as a shield to protect their secrets. The most disturbing consequence of this exploitation of faith was the way it corroded trust. Religion was the cornerstone of community life, a shared bond that provided hope in a harsh world. But under the Whitmers, it became a weapon. Those who should have been able to turn to Scripture for comfort instead found Scripture used against them as chains. The manipulation of sacred texts and spiritual authority ensured compliance, and the sense of guilt imposed on victims made them believe they themselves were to blame for what they endured. Faith, which should have offered liberation, instead became a prison that isolated them even further. Stories that later emerged suggest that sermons within the household carried veiled references to submission and sacrifice, messages that outsiders might hear as harmless, but which carried entirely different meanings for those trapped within. The layering of language was deliberate, ensuring that the same words could appear innocent to one listener and binding to another. This duality allowed the Whitmers to maintain an outward appearance of sanctity while deepening the psychological grip they held over their victims. The insidious brilliance of this approach was that it left no room for objection. A child who heard their suffering described as a covenant was left with no way to resist without believing they had defied God. A woman who was told her silence was evidence of holiness was bound in shame if she ever tried to speak. What made this exploitation even more horrifying was how it endured over time. The rituals became patterns woven into the very rhythm of household life until they seemed inescapable. Once faith had been distorted into obedience, the acts ceased to feel like isolated moments of cruelty and instead became the expected order of things. Each participant was locked within a cycle where their silence fed the family's power and the family's power fed their silence. This cyclical nature ensured that even if outsiders sensed something was wrong, the inner walls of the Whitmer household could not be breached, for those within had already been taught to accept the horror as sacred duty. The perversion of faith left scars that stretched far beyond the confines of the household. Those who later left the family or found the courage to speak carried with them the confusion of a childhood or youth spent believing that God had demanded their suffering. Their memories were not only of violation but of betrayal by the very foundation of their beliefs. It was this confusion that gave the story of the Whitmers such a haunting weight in Missouri's history, for it revealed how fragile faith could be when placed in the wrong hands, and how devastating the consequences became when devotion was turned into a mask for depravity. In the end, the exploitation of faith by the Whitmers ensured their practices could thrive in secrecy. It provided them with unquestioned authority, silenced their victims, protected them from community suspicion, and allowed their most horrific acts to be cloaked in the language of holiness. It was not merely that they committed atrocities, but that they committed them while convincing others that these acts were righteous, transforming the sacred into a weapon that left wounds far deeper than any physical scar. The most chilling element of the Whitmer story lies not only in the accusations of perverse rituals and the twisting of faith, but in the silence that surrounded those who endured it. Victims existed within an atmosphere where fear and shame worked together to create an unbreakable prison, a silence so suffocating that their suffering rarely reached beyond the walls of the household. In the Missouri frontier of 1839, the weight of reputation, the dominance of patriarchal authority, and the deeply ingrained fear of religious condemnation all converged to ensure that those most vulnerable had nowhere to turn. Within the Whitmer home, the victims were often isolated, denied the comfort of sharing their truth, and taught to believe that their pain was either holy sacrifice or unworthy of acknowledgement. It was a silence not born of choice, but of coercion, a silence that allowed horror to thrive in the shadows. The victims, often children and young women, carried the heaviest burden, for they were placed in positions where their innocence became a tool for manipulation. They were told that what they endured was a test of their faith, that the humiliation inflicted upon them was a divine mystery they were too young to understand, and that to speak of it would bring ruin not only upon themselves, but upon their family and their God. Fear was instilled in them from every direction. fear of punishment from those in power, fear of eternal damnation if they resisted, fear of rejection from a community that might see them not as victims, but as corrupted souls. This climate of terror left them paralyzed, unable to distinguish right from wrong, holy from profane, consent from coercion. Shame became the other weapon wielded against them, woven intricately into the fabric of their silence. Even if one had found the courage to resist, the weight of stigma was so overwhelming that the act of speaking would have felt like a confession of sin rather than an outcry of pain. In a deeply religious society, purity was a virtue valued above nearly all else, and any stain upon it, even one forced through violence, was seen as an indelible mark. Victims internalized this belief, carrying the crushing idea that they themselves were unworthy, broken, and guilty for what had been done to them. Thus, silence became not just enforced from above, but maintained from within, as shame convinced them they could not speak without destroying themselves entirely. Those who might have observed signs of distress were often too blinded by the Whitmer's reputation to intervene. Averted eyes, trembling hands, unusual withdrawal, sudden illnesses, or strange absences might have signaled to a more compassionate society that something was gravely wrong. But to most neighbors, the family's name and their religious position overrode such suspicions. When whispers surfaced, they were dismissed as slander or the wild imaginings of those envious of the family's stature. This dismissal left victims more deeply entrapped, for even if they had tried to voice their suffering, there was little chance their words would have been believed. Their silence was met not only with threats, but with the certainty that no one outside the household would protect them. In this way, silence became a cycle, passed from one generation to the next, an inheritance of fear. Those who grew up within the household saw how others before them endured without speaking, how resistance was futile, and how compliance ensured at least some measure of survival. This legacy of silence taught each new victim that speaking would bring only destruction. What began as a tactic to conceal horror hardened into a cultural expectation within the family itself, a code of silence so deeply ingrained that even when escape was possible, words remained locked in the throat, strangled by years of conditioning. The secrecy of their suffering also created a distorted intimacy between victim and perpetrator, for the very act of keeping the secret bound them together in a grim pact. Victims often felt complicit in their own silence, believing that by failing to speak, they had become accomplices rather than prisoners. This psychological burden further deepened their shame, making them believe they were responsible not only for their own suffering, but for enabling the suffering of others. The torment was thus not only physical but spiritual and emotional, leaving scars that could not easily be erased, scars that stretched far into adulthood and shadowed every relationship thereafter. The silence was also enforced by the broader environment of frontier life, where isolation was already the norm. Families lived miles apart, travel was difficult, and opportunities for outside intervention were rare. The Whitmer's household, deliberately closed off to outsiders, exploited this natural isolation to their advantage. Victims had nowhere to run, no safe neighbor to confide in, no authority willing to take their word over the Whitmers. The harsh geography of Missouri, with its wilderness and long distances, became yet another wall around their suffering, ensuring that cries for help would echo only within the confines of their home. Even as the years passed and fragments of their story seeped into public consciousness, the silence of the victims remained deafening. Many who endured never spoke openly, carrying their stories to the grave. Others whispered only in fragments, never daring to name the full truth, as though even memory itself had been contaminated by the shame imposed upon them. This lingering silence has left historians and storytellers piecing together faint outlines from rumor, scattered testimony, and the uncanny unease that surrounded the Whitmer name. What endures most powerfully is not a complete record of events, but the haunting weight of what could not be spoken, the vacuum left by voices that were never allowed to cry out. It is in this silence that the true horror of the Whitmer family's story resides, for while the acts themselves may have been monstrous, it was the forced muteness of their victims that ensured those acts could persist unchecked. Silence was the cloak that hid the darkness, the chain that bound the innocent, the weapon more effective than any physical restraint. It robbed the victims of their chance to be believed, it shielded the perpetrators from justice, and it allowed the family's public image of holiness to stand unchallenged while private atrocities unfolded behind closed doors. The story of the Whitmer family's darkness did not end within the confines of their home, for the shadow of their actions reached into history itself, leaving behind traces that could never be fully erased, though many tried. Communities thrive on stories, both those told openly and those whispered in secret, and in Missouri during the mid-19th century, the name Whitmer carried with it both a sense of reverence and unease. Official accounts and religious records portrayed them as pioneers of faith, men and women whose names were etched into the unfolding saga of a new religious movement. These accounts spoke of their devotion, their sacrifices, their role in shaping the future of a struggling community. Yet alongside these polished narratives lingered stories far more unsettling, stories that passed quietly from mouth to mouth, tales spoken in hushed tones around firesides, warnings delivered to children about what lay beneath the surface of a family too respected to be confronted directly. This dual legacy became a defining feature of their place in history. On one side, the Whitmers were preserved in print, in testimony, in the carefully recorded history of a religion that sought legitimacy and respectability in a hostile world. On the other side, their name became an unspoken reference to corruption, a whispered symbol of what happens when power and faith are twisted together. For those who dared to look beneath the official story, the darker narrative was impossible to ignore. The silence of victims, the secrecy of the household, the manipulation of faith, all of it wove together into a tale that haunted the edges of Missouri's collective memory. It was not something most people would write down, but something that remained alive in the form of unease, suspicion, and rumor, persisting long after the Whitmers themselves had passed from the stage of history. The attempt to bury this darker chapter was deliberate. Records that might have hinted at scandal were quietly set aside, testimonies that questioned the family's behavior were omitted or discredited, and the voices of victims were drowned in the louder proclamations of faith and devotion. The young movement to which the Whitmers had been tied could not afford such stains, for every hint of depravity threatened to unravel the fragile structure of authority on which it relied. Thus, the official histories were scrubbed clean, presenting the family as steadfast, faithful, and tragically misunderstood in their conflicts with others. Yet no amount of careful editing could erase the weight of what was remembered outside the pages of record books. For every written denial, there existed the persistent memory of neighbors, the uneasy glances of those who lived nearby, the fragments of testimony passed down quietly through families who had heard enough to know that the Whitmers' home was not a place of holiness, but a place of fear. This tension between official narrative and whispered truth has ensured that the Whitmer story lingers as something unresolved, something never fully confronted. Historians looking back often find themselves wrestling with contradictions. How could a family so integral to the foundations of a faith also be the subject of such disturbing rumors? How could their names be spoken in both reverence and dread? These contradictions themselves are a testament to the way their darkness was buried, not forgotten, leaving behind an incomplete history in which the most terrifying details exist only in shadow. For those who search the archives, the gaps are often more telling than the words. What is not said, what is omitted, what disappears from the record at just the right moment, reveals the deliberate effort to conceal a legacy too horrifying to face openly. The shadow of this concealment is what makes the Whitmer story so haunting. It reminds us that history is not only what is written, but also what is deliberately left unsaid. Every silence in the record becomes a void where the truth might have been, every omission a space where victims' voices should have been heard. These absences echo through time, carrying with them the weight of suffering that was never acknowledged. In this way, the story of the Whitmers is not simply one of private horror, but of a broader complicity, a community, and a faith willing to turn away from the darkness in order to preserve appearances. That willingness to look away is what allowed the shadow to endure, stretching from 1839 Missouri into the present, where fragments of the truth still unsettle those who encounter them. Even today, the name Whitmer evokes a peculiar mixture of fascination and dread for those who dig into the darker corners of early American history. Their official legacy remains polished, tied to scripture and testimony, but their whispered legacy endures in the stories that refuse to die. This dual inheritance is itself a haunting, for it ensures that their memory will always be split, never whole, forever caught between sanctity and corruption. Those who try to reconcile the two legacies find themselves facing the uncomfortable reality that both can exist simultaneously. that a family can shape the course of a faith while also inflicting horrors within their own walls. This truth unsettles because it resists the clean lines that history often tries to draw, forcing us to acknowledge the messiness of human legacy and the persistence of shadows that can never be erased. The persistence of these shadows has turned the Whitmer family into a kind of ghost in Missouri's past, their presence lingering in the air, not through monuments or memorials, but through unease and silence. In the quiet corners of towns where they once lived, in the scattered archives where their names appear but their actions disappear, there remains a sense of unfinished business, a story not fully told. The horror lies not only in what they did but in how successfully it was hidden, leaving behind only fragments for later generations to piece together. These fragments are enough to suggest a truth darker than most are willing to face, a truth that transforms the Whitmer family from pioneers of faith into symbols of the dangers that arise when power, secrecy, and sanctity combine unchecked. Thus the historical shadow of the Whitmers endures, not as a clear narrative but as a haunting absence, a silence that stretches across time. Their story reminds us that the past is never as clean as the records suggest, that behind every polished history there may lie horrors deliberately concealed. It lingers in the whispers of descendants, in the unease of historians who sense something missing, and in the silence of victims whose suffering was swallowed by the need to protect a name that history was too eager to sanctify.